Hello, everyone, and welcome to APIS Training. This is the third installment in our webinar series on AI, artificial intelligence, this time entitled The Future of AI. My name is Martin. I work here at APIS Training. I'm a senior instructor and consultant, and I will be kind of a moderator and attentive student for the lecture today. The lecture will be presented by our good friend, Dr. Manoj Shiba, joining us from Johannesburg, South Africa. Manoj, how are you?
Good in yourself, Martin. Really, always nice. The internet allows us to connect across vast
It's
spaces.
nice, isn't it? And
Yeah,
especially, it's so convenient with the same time zone, isn't it?
well, that helps as well, right?
That does help as well. So, today we are going to spend an hour together, or rather, we have an hour to spend, and the plan is for Manoj to speak for 45 minutes or so. We have the possibility to have questions after that. So, if you're listening to this, you can ask questions by using the Q&A function, questions and answers, in the user interface of the live event that you're using. So it's the little cartoon balloon with a question mark in it. You can click there and you can put your question in, and maybe I will lift it up to Dr. Chibo while in the middle of the talk, or maybe we'll take it afterwards, depending on the nature of the question. So this is it's such an interesting topic. This I mean, anyone who loves science fiction would love artificial intelligence, right? You know, all the imagery and everything is very science fictiony. I have I'm going to let you start in a moment. I have a good friend who's happens to be a CTO in the mining industry, and he has uses as a litmus test to see if something is interesting or new. To ask the question, how did they do it during the Stone Age? And you can actually answer most of those questions. You know, how did they do communication, transportation, entertainment, eating, everything? You can actually answer that. But for some things, the question doesn't really even make sense. Does it, right? I mean, how would you answer that, Manoj? How did they do AI during the Stone Age?
I'm sure they did do it in some way, but I just can't think of it right now, Martin. So that's
I,
a
I,
great,
I I
that's a
can't
great
either,
question.
and that is sort of the point that this is so it's such a paradigm shift and so new, which makes it so fascinating to talk about. So as I mentioned, I will be minimized to a smaller portion of the screen, and I will listen attentively to you. I will probably interject with questions. If you want to ask questions, feel free to do that. We can have sort of a dialogue going, but I will let you take center stage and just go with it. So, show, the show's on.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Martin. As you're talking now, I'm also thinking, we're here talking about the future of AI, when AI has just come about and it's really started, making its impact on business, societies, and countries as well. And we're starting to see this global, let me call it a movement around understanding artificial intelligence. And something I'm going to touch on later on, which is the movement out of the fourth industrial revolution and into what we're calling the fifth industrial revolution, which is partly driven by artificial intelligence as a key ingredient to this. But as we start thinking about the future, I think, Martin, and before I start, we've learned many lessons, from your colleague who's in the mining industry, but we've learned lessons from the first industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution, the third industrial revolution, and now currently the fourth industrial revolution. Is I hope we've learned some of our mistakes that we've made in the past and through those revolutions, and how do we make sure that we don't repeat them moving into the future. But I think conceptually that's much easier. In our last webinar, we spoke about ethics as an example, which is something, really highlighting something that we forgot about when we went through the third industrial revolution and, the internet, because that was the third industrial revolution to a large extent, connectivity. And what we're seeing is this digital divide. And the digital divide that affects you, me, and everyone around the world in some shape or form, either directly or indirectly. But with that said, when we start thinking, about artificial intelligence, it goes without wondering that we've known about the field at least since the 1950s. But we've got the ideal, confluence, or what I like to call the ingredients all coming together at the right time to really have a positive effect and impact on the now, but also into the future.
Did you
So what I
just
want
say
to
that
talk
we've
about,
had artificial intelligence since 1950s, or did I
yeah,
misunderstand that?
no, 100% correct. So we've known about AI with the Turing test, which if I remember correctly, was either
Sure.
1954 or 1957. So it's just now that we've got the technological power to be able to really, use it and implement it. So it's not a new field.
Oh, I see.
Now
I
it's a
understand. We've been talking
yeah,
about it for such a long
yeah,
time, and now we're actually able to do
doing it.
anything about it.
That's it.
I
And
noticed you
Martin,
talk about Industry 5.0, and I
yeah,
read up a little bit on the topic before here, and I saw that popping up everywhere.
yeah.
So if you could just very briefly, for me and maybe everyone else, just tell us about what the previous revolutions were, since there's so much about
Yes.
5.0 here. Just what was 1, 2, 3, 4?
So I'm going to work backward because I think it's just easier from
Sure.
our side. We're in the fourth industrial revolution right now, where the power essentially sits in the consumer's hands, and we've got to be worrying about environment and other issues as well. But what we're seeing in the third industrial revolution was really the internet. The second industrial revolution was primarily electrification, and the first industrial revolution was really about industrialization, if I can call it that. When we look way back into time, around the 1860s specifically. But we've often slipped through them. And then if we look forward, what is the fifth industrial revolution, Martin, is this interaction between humans and machines. We've been using the term cobot, but I think we're going to start working much more as we come, in the next probably 2 to 3 years, if I can say, more interactions with machines rather than humans. Martin, everyone here, yourself, myself included, at some stage we've interacted with a chatbot. A chatbot is a machine. It's a piece of a pop-up that pops up on a website or something like that. We've been dealing with it, we just haven't. I find it fascinating. We've been speaking to our phones as well and asking, instead of typing up what I'm looking for, I may ask in my example here, hey Siri, and Siri then talks to me. I mean, we're interacting with machines already. It might be in a small amount, but we're going to start seeing this, starting to catch and really, how do I use, it's probably the right word is explode. As more people get comfortable with it. Like everything else, there's going to be a bunch of early adopters, myself included, and then, it starts seeing mass traction as we start moving forward in the world as well. So this fifth industrial revolution is leveraging, from my perspective, the third industrial revolution, the internet, the electrification, and you can see the shift from, coal powered to more sustainable uses of energy. So it's the second industrial revolution plus the third industrial revolution, plus what we've learned and what we're in right now, this digital age, if I can call it that, and then how do humans and machines truly interact together. And I think that for me is where the core of AI really sits. And AI is said to be the fuel that is going to spur this fifth industrial revolution, Martin. And that's going to be massive for all of us to understand, both from an individual perspective as well as an organizational perspective, and then what does it mean at a country level as well. So I hope that sort of just gives a little bit of a flavor there, Martin.
Sure. Thanks a lot. Just sort of follow-up question on that. Are we in the very, very early stages of the fifth industrial revolution right now, or does everyone agree that yes, it has started for real, or I'm guessing we're not in the middle of it, right?
No, definitely
N-
not.
No.
Um,
I'm looking
there's
around, and still a lot
definitely
of companies are sort of boasting about Industry 4.0 still.
yeah. We
Uh,
we
so
we. I want to say, Martin. I think we're probably at the infancy stage. It's probably it's the murmurs that you're seeing. These are the telltale signs that started and kicked off the fourth industrial revolution. Think of the internet, Martin. From the time the internet was sort of born to the time that it was ubiquitous, you and I, all of us had access to it to some extent. How long was that time span?
I was just
We'd
thinking
probably say that
exactly that, actually. I was
yeah,
thinking back, and I figured, well, I mean, less than 10 years, I think. Is it the
And
same
so,
for this?
yeah, probably shorter just because of the ideal circumstances. There's always, it's the ideal set of events that are happening to spur this on. Unfortunately, depending on which way we want to look at this here, things like mass adoption of digitization, some companies still in a digitization phase or digitalization phase, but we've seen over, let's call it the last 18 months to 20 months through COVID-19 specifically, and we're pretty much still in the pandemic, but how that pandemic has accelerated digital transformation as a broad category. Now, when you put those ingredients together, you've got the ideal ingredients for the implosion or the explosion of the fifth industrial revolution. My speculation is, and it is a speculation that I've been looking at and really wondering about and really, articulating to some extent, do we have the right ingredients and how long will it take us to get there? My first point is that it's inevitable. At the rate that we're seeing AI being used, adopted across industries, being enabled, specifically in the telecoms industry as well, and the critical role, when we speak, you and I speak about 6G, we only need 5G to be able to leverage AI, if you think about it. And so we've already got that ingredient relatively stable, relatively bedded down. And so what we start seeing is that the confluence of all of this is going to cause this to happen. I speculate, Martin, in the next 3 to 5 years, we would have forgotten, the fourth industrial revolution completely. There's always going to be late adopters, as you and I may be early adopters in interacting with machines. There's going to be late adopters as well, which say this is now moving along. We need to get onto this train. But with that said, it's 3 to 5 years in my perspective. We've been in the fourth industrial revolution for quite some time. It's not something that's new now, but it just means that we were late to adopt it. And I think this is where we're going to start seeing humans, you and I firstly, then organizations use the fifth industrial revolution to possibly springboard any programs such as digital transformation that is happening in the fourth industrial revolution to spur them on into the fifth industrial revolution. It's just going to accelerate. And I think there's good reason not to be the first mover, and there's also good reason to be the first mover. So it just depends on your organization and what exactly you want to achieve from a strategic perspective on that. Is that good, Martin?
Yeah. This is
Yeah.
fascinating. Absolutely. I'm uh, I'm curious about some things. I mean, I'm curious about the. You talked a lot about the fifth industrial revolution, of course. I'm curious about seeing more concrete use cases is always good. If you say AI will be an important part of this,
Yeah.
exactly what will that look like? I noticed you using the word cobot there. I hadn't seen that before. Studying up a little bit on this, I found it. It seemed coined by a Danish company who worked with robots and humans together. So collaborative robot, is that it? Cobot?
That, yeah, that's it. But
Yeah.
it's got a bit of a broader meaning as well. It's the human machine interaction to a large extent, and we call the machine the bot as an example. You
Ah,
know,
okay.
we yeah we spoke about what Boston Dynamics had been doing for many years ago when they created a dog, in this or a machine in the shape of a dog called Spot. It's doing a world tour at the moment where they programmed it to do X, Y, and Z things. It looks like a dog, and they're trying to program it to do very specific, like an animal. The dog, movements, follow some instructions, and they've been relatively successful of that. But now, what does that mean? Is that instead of thinking of a real dog, you'd probably be interacting with a machine dog, which sounds a bit far fetched. But we must never forget that that's what I'm talking about, the interaction between human and machine. So it's not working, it's not as we work right now. If I think about my computer that I'm on, I give the instruction and whatever I'm typing is what it gives me, in a Word document as an example. But when we start seeing the interaction, there may be this stage where it becomes like, Manoj, you're saying this here? I suggest that we start saying that as well and in that as well. So a little bit of more intelligence, if I can put it that way, not just a passive recipient of instruction from you or me as an example, but also co-creating, let's call it a paragraph or a story, a narrative, or even a song, we always talk about music and art in artificial intelligence. And the reason we talk about that, because that gives us an understanding of the complexity, but also the ability of what AI can do from a perspective of being creative. We've seen the musical experiments that have been done. The movie's title just escapes me right now, but there was an entire movie trailer that was created by artificial intelligence, drawing in and scanning throughout the entire movie, and then coming up with an appropriate trailer for the movie in a very short period of time. Now, what we're going to see is the creative director, as an example, interacting with the AI to say, yes, okay, you're suggesting that, I may want to also bring in that. What do you think? So it's almost having a conversation, Martin. And I know that sounds very, when you talk about futuristic, it sounds very Jettison-like, us flying around in spaceships as well. But it's where things are going. And I must qualify that, Martin, because we can talk about these terms. Where's the evidence? Like you say, where are the case studies? I think the first indicator that we've got here is really around the market revenue being generated by artificial intelligence and its expected growth into the future. If we look at all the statistics in terms of, there's a rapid rise in companies and how much money from a revenue perspective that's been generated. We're forecasting about 35 billion US dollars this year alone, but we're also forecasting by the year 2025 about $126 billion globally from a revenue perspective. So we've seen that from a revenue perspective, but we've also seen from a startup company perspective the massive growth in the number of AI startup companies that is also couched by another metric in how many of them are reaching a $1 billion US dollar valuation. So we briefly touched on that, and it's a nice recall to the last session that we did, is that, we're seeing the AI unicorn club really growing exponentially. We're probably speculating by, the end of this year, we'll probably have about 40, 45 new companies with $1 billion valuation. Now, we must understand where that comes from, because I think you opened this up very brilliantly today, is how, when we mention artificial intelligence, what images does it conjure up in our minds? And for me, that's about how do we think of the art of the possible into the future? Now, we never imagined billion-dollar AI companies, but the fact that many venture capitalists, private equity firms, and other various funders are backing these AI firms is that they will spur on this market that eventually becomes, the norm for you and I. Martin, it's as simple as, or not as simple, but rather as an assumption that if I say, Manoj, we're going to start at 5 o'clock, that at 5 o'clock, Manoj will connect, onto this call as an example here, which is underpinning an assumption that internet is there, he's got all the right ingredients and we're good to go. And I think that's what's going to happen, is that it's going to fall into the background from a perspective of it's a given, it's something that we all can expect everyone to have, like many of us expect everyone to have, water, electricity, and the basic necessities to live. So I think AI, definitely from all the indicators that we've seen and we look at, and even if we map it back to things such as, the social media boom and every other major boom that we've had, this has got the right ingredients coming up. And so just looking at that. But the one I must say, Martin, which I haven't mentioned here, is many studies have been done by both, and I say the consulting houses, the big consulting houses, the universities out in the world as well. And many of them have often said, what is the top 30, top 40 emerging technologies of the future? Artificial intelligence, over the next 10 years is ranked as a number one technology. We've seen this because of multiple different dimensions that are looked at. The first dimension, or one of the dimensions that we haven't spoken about, but that is taken into consideration, is what they call social media buzz. So what are people talking about? And I think it's such a nice analogy, because the moment you and I talk about something, it is human nature that we start adopting and following it through. It's if Martin, if you keep thinking and talking about going to visit Denmark, as you mentioned earlier, as an example, eventually over the next few months or so, you'll convince yourself to take that trip to Denmark and under whatever rationale you'll use. But the point I'm making here is that social media buzz is an important indicator of what the potential is for some of these technologies that are out there. And number one, is not cybersecurity, but artificial intelligence. And then we started seeing, obviously, the most critical ingredient of AI being data come through as well. So I hope that gives, some context around why, AI into the future as well, because I think that's really, really important, Martin. And then looking forward, as the title of this talk is, it's the future of AI. And how do we know this?
Yeah, and it is interesting to learn what it is that is pushing it forward. And you're saying it's being pushed forward by us just doing this right now, for instance. But you're mentioning also the market and these large organizations and corporations that invest a lot of money in this. And I'm wondering, what's the percentages between greed and philanthropy between these two? I mean, you can, I want to better the world. AI will make the world better, compared to I want to make a huge pile of money with this
Yeah.
AI investment. Is it like 0, 100, or is it some kind of mix? Would you think?
I would postulate that it has to be a mix, right? And that's why, for the first time, I think we started talking about the ethical side of artificial intelligence. We've known about the problems that pop up with the use of just blanket use of AI for things such as efficiency or efficacy in organizations. And so for the first time, like I said, is that what we're doing is we're bringing to the fore to address this problem of greed versus what's better for humankind, if I can put it that way, Martin. And what is that balance? We must also never forget that this is primarily driven by shareholders and broader community stakeholders. So when we talk about shareholders, I'm always reminded at the back of my mind that it's not only about the shareholder, it's also about each and every stakeholder, including the employees, the communities within which these big organizations are built, set up, employ individuals as well. There has to be an ideal balance. And I think what we do see now is going to be a fundamentally different fifth industrial revolution, because we are making the right noises, if I can say that, Martin, but we're saying the right things which address the past problems of things such as the digital divide, right? Now, as I say that, is that I think it's going to become more responsible. I think big corporations, big and small, but big corporations, if we just think in our recent history, many of them could get away with whatever they wanted to do and it would fly under the radar unless the big media picked it up. In this day and age, something small, and there's a lot of voice that can be given to, let me call it, the minority or the individuals out there to hold big companies to account. And by holding bigger companies to account, it forces companies everywhere to do the right thing. Now, what is the right thing, Martin? I think it's a balance between how do we grow and move society forward positively, but also not forgetting that business needs to remain sustainable, not from a greed perspective, but from an income, revenue, profitability perspective. But in saying that, can AI definitely change the world from the positive side? I think yes, it can. I think there's opportunities, and we're starting to see this globally right now. Again, unfortunately, as a consequence or some impact or after effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, is that it is going to create new jobs that you and I probably haven't even thought about. We've all heard that before, Martin. But for me, what's important about that is what are the skills that we need? I think often what you and I do is we focus on the future jobs, not the future skills that are required. And those skills of critical thinking, problem solving are well known. But those are skills we required in every revolution, we require on a daily basis. The only difference now is that learning doesn't happen only in a space and in a time. Learning is a lifelong, continual journey. And if I look at myself, I'm not the youngest person out there, but I've got to learn. And I've got to learn new things every week. And there has to be practical ways for you and I, Martin, come next week, this becomes irrelevant, and we've got to now reinvent ourselves to a large extent. Oh, you can't reinvent yourself quickly. So what you've got to do is make sure that you're at the forefront of gaining some relevant skills that you may believe are going to be needed in the future. And if you're on this call, we've all got the resources. I often say the only constant there's been in time or over a period of time, in our history specifically, is this notion of time. There's 24 hours in a day. There's 60 minutes in an hour, and there's still 60 seconds in a minute. And so, how do we use that time, Martin? And how do we make sure that we also self-preserve to a large extent and say, I'm blocking out a piece of time to learn a skill that makes me and keeps me relevant. I also think we've got to start thinking as individuals, as an organization. And so when we talk about the positive side, there's definitely a bright future. It's just an uncertain, foggy future. When I say foggy, it doesn't mean that we don't have insights into the future. Look at what you and I are talking about today. It is up for anyone to be able to start thinking, you know, the data points that are being put together to come to a certain conclusion, do I really, get onto that and say, okay, this does make sense? Or do I use my critical thinking skill and say, those data points, but is there something else as well? So we've always got to think for ourselves. And so from the positive side that we see from an AI perspective is definitely, new jobs which require a different mix of skills to a large extent. Then we've got to think about
Can we say anything about those skills? Because I like to latch on to your idea about time being sort of a natural resource there, and I mean it has been said for I think all these industrial revolutions that the things are taking our jobs. Even back to the first one, you have these weaving machines and what have you. They're taking our jobs, and then you have electricity and so on. Um, there's always this scare that you're going to lose your job, and it always
yeah.
turns out that you don't lose your job, but instead you need to learn something new, which is exactly what you're saying right now. You need to adapt and adjust your skills. Can we say anything about the skill set that will be required to survive or even prosper in the
Yeah.
fifth industrial revolution world, which
I
is coming soon,
I
I
want to
hear
say,
from an expert in
yeah.
South Africa.
I want to say yes. I think, Martin, there is a set of skills. And I'm going to just broadly, sort of categorize the skills as thinking skills. The ability to use the most powerful computer in the world, which is sitting up here for each and every one of us. It's the ability to think. But when we think, we mustn't use what we call heuristics, rules of thumb to make decisions. We've got to sincerely take the time to interrogate what is driving my decision making. And so, from a skills perspective, if you've got the problem solving skills, the critical thinking skills, the analytical thinking skills, those will always be good for us because those skills are pliable across any job family that you and I may be thinking about, or when we do need to move from one space into another. As an example, Martin, if we have to move into the telecom space, the only thing that you and I would be able to rely on is our ability to think and think critically and solve problems. And that is a universal skill that will be required by everyone. The level at which we be able to obtain those skills is dependent on you and I. But then there's also going to be the softer skill, Martin, and I think we may be missing this. The ability to lead individuals who are constantly not going to be able to say that with 100% certainty, this is what the future looks like. The ability to deal with ambiguity. Now, as I say ambiguity, if I think of myself as an example, when we talk about an ambiguous future, it provides some anxiety for me because we must acknowledge that people want to have some sort of control over tomorrow, over the next day. And when your livelihood is being threatened by a machine, your first natural response is to push back. I'm saying we shouldn't be pushing back. What we should be doing is embracing and saying, how do we work together, which is this fifth industrial revolution, with the critical thinking, problem solving, and leadership skills that we require? Empathy. Machines can't show us empathy yet, but we've got some of those abilities innate in us. And those skills need to be, sort of highlighted. So the skills that you and I often don't talk about, don't highlight all the time, are the skills that are really going to be coming into the future. Less about how do I code. Martin, the one that's often that I keep hearing about, or I get kept asked about, Manoj, what coding language should I be learning? And what we're not seeing is that the world has already moved from a code to a no-code world. In other words, a few coders have decided to make this more, democratize the ability to do a machine learning model without you even knowing how to code one line by following a simple set of instructions. And so what happens is that we may be catching these waves a little bit too late from a skills perspective and saying this is the right thing to do. What we forget is that I often say it doesn't matter what coding language you're going to use, because the question is, what does coding teach you? When you learn how to code, it's about logic statements, that you're feeding something that's going to execute them, and you can see the result almost immediately. So along with those other skills, there's going to be human skills such as logic as well. And coding enables us to gain that logic skill, the ability to think in a very small piece, but also the ability to think more systematically, because everything in the world is a massive system, right, Martin? And I think those are the skills that we postulate are the ones that are going to be needed. And this is backed up by a lot of evidence that's come out of the World Economic Forum, again, who does massive studies and saying these are the skills of the future. The one thing I can just say, just on as the last point on that, Martin, is I don't think anyone can afford in this day and age to sit back and say, I'm fine for the next 5 or 10 years. It's about the ability to use that time and say, how do I use it? I, for example, personally, I know when I work the best, and I know what time of day I work the best. And so by understanding that, I acknowledge, and I do this on a weekly basis. On average, every week, I will spend a minimum of 3 hours learning something new. Whatever that something may be, Martin, it may be baking. And I know many people, when I say baking, they can't associate me with baking, but I love baking. But how do I learn something new about baking, as an example? In the world of artificial intelligence, on a weekly basis, I'm reading quite a bit and understanding and learning, what else is coming out. I've got the resources. It's about me apportioning my time, because it's Albert Einstein who said that if he had an hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes defining the problem. For within 5 minutes, he come up with the solution. We seem to mix it up because we become solution driven instead of problem solvers. And that's what we've got to start changing our mindset to as well.
I'm a baker too. Did you know that?
Ah,
I also love baking, and I love learning. So much of this really gels very well with my worldview, I think. I would love to be able to set away 3 hours. I was thinking, do I do that? And then I think, but I spend a lot of time helping my kids with homework, which forces me to learn things. Just a few minutes before we went live today, I was on the phone with my daughter talking about photosynthesis and cell breathing with her, and I needed to sort of refresh how that works. So relearning, I think. Can I just connect to something that you said, and I made a note of before today as well. Um, about what skills we have and what machines can do. Apparently, Elon Musk said at some point that excessive automation in his factories was a mistake, and he tweeted that humans are underrated. And again, sort of enforcing your view here that we have this magical computer in our brain. But I have, as a sort of skeptical thinker, then I have to ask: is this not just temporary? I mean, you even said yourself that machines can't show empathy, and then you added yet. So,
yeah.
is this something that will happen in Industry 6.0?
I'm still trying to get my head fully wrapped around Industry 5.0, but Martin,
Yeah.
fully, it could definitely, I think the first thing that we often said about artificial intelligence was that it can't be creative. And then we saw an entire movie trailer that was absolutely amazing and was really raved about when big tech and the production house got together.
Cool. Go on. I have to
And
tell
they
you something
presented.
about that, but go on. Let's just stick a pin in that.
But the creativity part is something we thought that was unique to us. But giving a machine, sort of, let's call it, the right data or sufficient data, is that it can do that job quicker, but also is only programmed to do that job specifically. Now, this is where Elon Musk has it right. Excessive automation is not a good thing, right? Excessive automation means that we can automate very rigid rules. Anything slightly out of that causes a problem for us, Martin. And it's still some time before we can say and build like you and I, that if something's, if there's a little bit of a deviation, that we can still to a large extent adapt quickly on the fly. The problem with excessive automation of everything is you have to build rigid rules. And these rigid rules are the things that really, stop us from being able to say, okay, if there's a small change in ambient temperature, as an example, what do I need to do? You and I can adapt quite quickly to that. Martin, we adapted quite well over the last 18 months when we were hit with a global pandemic. Many people adapted well. Machines may not adapt so well under certain circumstances like that. So to Elon Musk's point is that it's still excessive. What we do see is because we can do one process and then it becomes efficient, it affects the bottom line. It's like, okay, Manoj, you may need to rethink what skills and what you offer to the organization as an example. I keep arguing to say is that not everything in the world can be automated. It's not a problem to do that. But the amount of effort it would do and what value would you get out of automation is what we should be thinking about. And that's why the future, when we think about it, is automation, excessive automation now is the wrong thing. But in the future, if we can add in a little bit of intelligence, that may be something that becomes a reality. Now, how far in the future, Martin? It didn't take us too long to figure out how to use AI to create a movie trailer, the creative arts to a large extent. Paintings are being, sort of done by AI, and sometimes the human eye can't even see the difference between something painted by a machine versus an artist out there. And the machines learn. And so they not like you and I, humans, the first time we get told that we're wrong, it hurts us and we resist into it. Machines get told they're wrong and they fix it and they move along. Or you fix it and I fix it and it's rectified. We have that little bit of a barrier to say if I've committed wrong before I can sort of pick myself up and continue as well. So I think, that for me is always going to be an important point. But yeah, I'm fully aligned with Elon Musk here, at least on that, is that we must be careful about over emphasizing things such as automation. The fact that you can automate it right now does not mean that it's the right thing to do either, and that you're gonna reap the benefit of efficiency, productivity from doing that, Martin.
Right. I stuck a pin in something. I was going to ask another question, but I just remembered I had a comment about another thing. I'm not sure if you've seen it. I hadn't remembered it until you started talking about that movie trailer that I haven't seen. But I just remembered that I saw a documentary on musical created by AI. Have you seen that? Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
I've
a big
watched
fan
it.
of musical theater, and so I saw that, and I'm interested in AI and new things. So it was like best of all worlds, and I remember clearly they having the premiere, and they had some guests, some prominent guests. One of them were one of the creators of famous musical Les Miserables, and he went into the theater saying that computers will never be able to create something that evokes feelings the way we can, and then sort of cut to him walking out. I was wrong. I was wrong. It
No, look, I
was,
think that's where we've got to be careful, right?
yeah,
It's what we say can't be done right now. It doesn't mean someone somewhere is not working on it.
right.
My classic one, Martin, which you'll know, is you can order a pizza on your phone, but you can't 3D print it off your phone and eat it yet. And
Yet.
I always say yet because I'm sure somewhere, someone in the world, someone's watching it, or trying to figure it out to solve that thing. And it sounds sci-fi, but I think the reality is that we mustn't shut things out too quickly. And thinking about the future of artificial intelligence, as wild as some of these ideas may be, is that they actually may be real as well. The other part is, we never thought, we said, in the year 2000, we'll be using spaceships to travel. There's that famous cartoon, The Jetsons, as an example. And I think at the turn of the century, we thought we'd be there. I don't think we're too far off. Being 21, 22 years into the century now, we're not too far off from that. We started seeing, and I don't want to use the word, but it's Uberizing. I can order an Uber that will fly above ground as a single person and take me. So a drone essentially that I can order on my phone that can transport me from A to B above the ground, and yes, it's been built for a single person for now, but that is possible. It just, if it works, adoption will be there. Who thought about the self-driving car as well, Martin? I I initially resisted it and I thought, how can I sit there? And once I've experienced it, I'm like, I could get used to this now.
Right. And I appreciate you bringing in some concrete examples because I was thinking about sort of turning back to some some of those, because it sometimes can get very lofty and vague and fuzzy, talking about the future and skill sets and so on. And I was wondering just about if you have any ideas of what we can expect. I noticed you talking about Boston Dynamics in the beginning of this talk, and I've seen these videos. Of course, they're fantastic on YouTube. The dogs and the big dog, and just not so long ago, we saw these humanoid robots doing the flips and going in monkey bars and everything. And the thought occurred to me when seeing that video a little while ago, does this have anything to do with AI? Is this just a programmed robot, or is there AI in here? And in that case, what does it do?
Yeah, and I think, Martin, that's such a good question because we must never forget what artificial intelligence really is. It really boils down to being an umbrella term which includes things such as deep learning, supervised learning, unsupervised learning, which we largely covered in one of our few earlier webinars. But around natural language processing, the ability to have a conversation with myself and my phone, as an example here. Vision, that's vision, the ability to say, when I see something, as an example, if I just lift my phone up again, is that this is a phone, this is a human, this is a nose, this is a ears. That's all artificial intelligence, which is driven by data and the tagging of images. You train computers to do this. So when it sees something that looks like a human with the eyes, the nose, the ears, that it picks up, avoid, and move. It's not just a sensor that says move this way or don't move that way, which is pre-programmed, but it learns, to a large extent. If I see something like that looks like this, I can continue because this thing, the human, may move out of the way for me. And it learns that by quite simply using its past experience, which for all intents and purposes, Martin, is data. And so when we think about this, it's not simply programmed to go open a door. The door height is also at a different level. Whether the door opens by being pushed outward or being pulled inward is also going to be done from an intelligence perspective, to be able to teach a robot how this may look. The ability to teach a robot to see how you and I write the number 4 or the number 7 is an example. Those are classic examples for us there, Martin, of we teach it and then it starts self-learning, what we often call machine learning. We supervise it, much like a child is supervised. You spoke about your daughter. Sorry about that, Martin. I think about my kids is when they're small, we've supervised their learning. After a while, and I don't know how old your daughter is, Martin, but my 12-year-old is
She's 12.
unsupervised learning right now. There we go.
Yeah.
Unsupervised learning. They learn things themselves as well. So this is not far-fetched. What we're seeing from an AI perspective is what you and I were doing as parents, or are doing as parents as well, which I think is really critical for us to remember. So the art of the possible is really there. We also program our kids to believe in a certain way. But after a while, like you and I, the older we get, guess what? It opens up and they may learn new things, cultures, languages, things that you and I didn't teach. And that learning is self-taught then, to a large extent. We just lay the foundation. So in that robot, as we're talking as an example, it is programmed to say, this is the base, but then thereafter, you're going to learn by yourself and then come to some endpoints there. I do want to reiterate, though, is that none of these machines should be left by themselves. No machine should be left by themselves to make a decision. There should be an automatic ability for humans to override those decisions that are made by machines, especially now, moving into the next 3 to 5 years at least. And the reason we should do that is because if we leave everything up to machines from a decisioning making perspective, is that all we will be doing is perpetuating our past biases into the future. And that's one of the things that we need to think about from a societal perspective, Martin, is how do we address some of those unintended, unconscious bias that we've always had, that when we're faced with it now, that we can actually start correcting it into the future instead of really, perpetuating it into the future as well.
Right. I read some stuff that on that topic, whether it should be how it should be governed, whether it should be governed by whom. I read from one company called Master Control. They said highly integrated systems are vulnerable to systemic risks such as total network collapse. This was a no. That was the company actually referenced a research paper from Omics. They say extreme connectivity creates new social and political structures. If left unchecked, they might lead to authoritarian governance. That doesn't sound good. And
That's
a
definitely.
guy called Dr. Marcel Volmer said, um, governments around the world and the leading high-tech companies need to define a framework to define the rules for machine intelligence. Humans might no longer be capable to fully understand the algorithms defined, but as long as we can define when and how to pull the plug, the rules are mastered by us humans.
Yeah.
Any
Look, I
thoughts on
think,
that?
yeah, and I think, this goes to something called an AI ethical framework. And I think that that is going to always be critical, Martin, is that we need to create these frameworks within which our organizations, I'm just going to start at the organizational level as a critical, let me call it, bridge between governments, economies, and individuals. The organization generally sits in the middle. I think we need this AI framework, and how do we start thinking about it from an organizational perspective? We can't just leave things to machine up to proprietary algorithms. Proprietary algorithms for me are just a way of saying, I can't let this out because I'm scared of the backlash that I may get based on what I'm putting into this algorithm to tell you whether you qualify for things such as credit or no credit, as an example, or you qualify for, travel or don't travel. And I think we need to keep that in check. We need to make it explicit so it becomes open, not proprietary, because the real competitive advantage organizations are going to face with that is not around the proprietary algorithm, rather its use and its deployment from a product service perspective. And so I think we need greater transparency in all the algorithms. And I think, big tech has taken this challenge up as well. They're starting to be more open about what is driving the recommendation systems that you and I often face, Martin, when we log on to something based on what we've watched. That's the one side of it, but we do need an AI ethics framework. Now, ethics, like I always, my view on ethics is, ethics is never right or wrong. There's always some part in the middle. And there's some part in the middle, is that gray area called ethics for me. And I think that's where we've got to go back to human morals. What do we want? What do we want to make sure, instead of an authoritarian government or authoritarian government, yeah, is that we want to make sure that they also kept in check as those may pop up as well. Is that what is driving that? And then make sure, Martin, think of us baking again. We know if we put in a dry ingredient and a wet ingredient, then a dry ingredient is a problem. You've got to do your dry ingredients first and then your wet ingredients together. And so when we start thinking about that, we've got to keep ourselves in check. So when we catch someone or a company says, listen, oh, hold on, we're putting a dry ingredient with a wet ingredient on now, that's going to create a problem from an ethical framework perspective. And the implications are things that, as a company, we may struggle with. So I think from that perspective, we have to create it. Are there seeds to it? I think there are. And I think, Martin, this is not within the organization. This sits at what I call, your executive board level. So it's not the chief executive, if I just think of a traditional organization, but at the board, your non-executive directors and some of your executive directors. This onus needs to sit on them. I even say that I think a future job or a future job title that needs to exist in every organization, regardless of size, is a CEO, but instead of a chief executive officer, but a chief ethics officer. And that chief ethics officer needs to understand what the business is doing and what are the ethical bounds within which the organization wants to operate to make sure they also gain what we call the social license to operate. So what we're reading out there from an AI perspective, you also need to gain social license to operate. A social license to operate indicates also that when I do something, is that there's minimal or no harm being done to society. And that social license to operate is extremely powerful. I think, Martin, we mustn't forget about events such as the Arab Spring, which was completely organized on social media. But we can start picking that up. If I bring it more recent to what we've seen, is that there's many reports, and I think they've released the algorithm. I haven't looked at it yet, but sort of the COVID-19 pandemic or coronavirus pandemic. And I think in late 2019, there was already a Canadian company that had already predicted that this thing, if left unchecked, will become a global pandemic. So I think we've got some early indications that if we don't react in time, there could be a lot more negative consequences. But directly asking the question of who, I think this needs to be, industry bodies that govern this. Here we need probably a few regional, global AI associations that agree on a set of guiding principles, and then organizations to adopt it. As I think we all are fully aware of things such as sustainable development goals. That's a brilliant, and companies then choose which ones they're going to be really focusing on. And I think from an ethics perspective, that's what needs to be done. If left unchecked, I do get worried, Martin. I think then what you're talking about becomes a reality.
Manoj, we are nearing the end of the hour, but I would like to touch a little bit upon some of our customers. We have customers as well, you know. A lot of them are
Sure.
in the telecommunications business. They are
Yeah.
telco providers and vendors and consultants and so on. Do you think you could oblige me by saying a little bit about how they will be affected by the future of AI or anything that they would need to think about specifically for their business?
Yeah. And I think that's such a good. I think, currently, Martin, we often in the telco industry, if I can just call it that for now, is, we often look at artificial intelligence as allowing us to do network optimization, preventative maintenance, customer service, and some sort of fraud detection as well. And we're starting to see that being used. But that's the now, you know. But in the future, for telco companies, I think, and you spoke about 6G. I often think, 5G is going to be the most critical lever here, because it really allows for the enhancing and, of the speed and the integration of other technologies. It speeds up services in the cloud while AI analyzes and learns from the same data faster. Hand in glove, I think, is the analogy or the metaphor, is that we require the 5G to be able to start looking at a connected world differently, in which artificial intelligence relies on that connectivity, because that connectivity, as a small sensor sends data, the quicker it can get the data, the quicker it can learn from that data. So it's not about being working separately, but how do you work hand in glove here? A connected world with a lag is a recipe for disaster. We often talk about the concept of a smart city. If the sensors are not firing at least in very close, near real time, because of a lag in the speed of being able to transmit those messages, we've got a problem, Martin. We've got a huge, huge problem. It's not going to work. And that not working means there's going to be bigger consequences, especially for individuals that may be relying on it. And into the future, as more people start relying on it, it becomes even more of a disaster if there's a bigger lag. To think about it, if you resisted the mobile, phone place specifically, and adopting this sort of, let me call it, technology, you were almost left out. You were left out from communicating with the world, as an example. If you refused, Martin, to learn how to send a message or to write or type an email, I think we'd be left out from the communications world. So even the late adopters had to adopt at some stage. I remember the times before email, Martin. I was saying to someone yesterday, actually, I remember my first email, and I was like, wow, what is this? And I sat there looking at the computer to say, what does this do? You mean I don't need to send a letter that takes a day to get to someone? It's instantaneous. Yes, and you can have and so it went on. So I think telecommunications is really the backbone to this here. And without the telecommunications, let me call it, entire ecosystem, artificial intelligence's, progress, its real impact, and I'm going to talk about positive impact on societies and economies and on individuals, can be lost. So it's a critical enabler. And I want to talk about it as an enabler for now. But there's also, the benefit that telco companies can receive from artificial intelligence. Because even if I just talk briefly about, saying that 5G is the cornerstone of the infrastructure for and volume, variety, and sufficiency of data that AI needs to be successful, it has to be mutually beneficial. And that mutual beneficial, benefication, if I can use that word, is that AI in return can be used for the network planning, false prediction, security, reduction of operating costs. So as much as you enable, there's also benefit for both. So it's not a zero-sum game of you need me, therefore I will extract maximum rent, but also more specifically from my side, that AI can return the favor, if we call it that. And then really starts opening up the possibilities for all organizations out there. I think the metrics are going to be important. And I think from our side, specifically, the role of from a telco company perspective, I think we've got to look beyond the metrics. We've got to understand that we play a critical role, in society, the growth of society in the future, because that's where telco companies are really there. And I think we've seen that. We've got a reliance on the connectivity to make a phone call, as an example, just as one of many examples, connecting, making sure I can connect when I want to connect as well. And telco companies have really bedded that down. But that reliance as to AI is also reliant to a large extent, because this concept of a smart city, which I'm still to fully experience, and I'm still trying to find a city that's truly smart, is going to largely depend, and the economic development of countries, of individuals, and the future human projection, progression is largely going to depend on the telco infrastructure and how that is done. And so this opens up huge opportunities for telco companies specifically to start diversifying as well. And in that diversification, the ability to say, how do we generate, revenue and bottom line impact for our organization? And in this case, the stakeholders, and then still thinking and taking into consideration our broader stakeholders and shareholders. The one thing I do want to say at the end there, Martin, sorry, is that, who in the telco companies? And I want to take this away, and I just want to close the loop on it, because it's not about IT. It's not about the executive managers. It is about the board of directors. This needs to be driven from a strategic imperative. I think anything that's going to be driven technically, somewhat strategically internally, is going to be a big problem. It needs to be drawn, sort of pushed down from the board down. That's where the onus should sit. Much like the chief ethics officer, there has to be board responsibility around it as well.
Thank you. Do you think that AI will change the telco landscape? You were talking about, telco companies as if that were a well-defined group, and we know our good old AT&Ts and Verizons and so on. But I mean, that landscape has changed, and suddenly, Amazon and Google and those companies are popping up and actually taking shares there. Do you think AI will change who is a telco company in the future, or?
Yeah. Martin, it's such a nice question, because it will start driving the birth of new business models. How it does that is, how quickly can we sense what changes are happening in the market, and how quickly can we react? How do we get offerings much better, richer in value propositions to our end consumers, B2B or B2C? And we're starting to see the big tech companies do that. As you talk about Amazon, if we just think of Amazon as a conglomerate, Amazon is in almost every sector of the economy that you and I can think about. They're in media, entertainment, retail, they're even in logistics, and so what we are seeing is, and if we think about it, they're quick to react, and the ability for AI to help us understand what's happening in the environment. I'm always reminded, as we talk about the external environment and how AI can help us strategically as organizations, that the one thing that AI is very good at is that if you can teach it which are the critical data points to look out for out in the environment, it can do all the heavy lifting for you in near real time, which enables your decision making. So in competitions coming up, or the environment, your market conditions are changing, it will pick that up quite quickly from a sensoring perspective. And the point here is that AI can really help us rethink the way we view the organization. What do our consumers want? We can start picking that up quite quickly and seeing where we may be slipping a little bit, but also how do we start addressing and making sure we give constant or consistent customer experiences, both at the right place, but through the right time, the right channel, and what consumers want in a B2B or B2C space.
Right. Thank you so much for that. We have 2 minutes to round this off. I'm thinking I'm thinking back to whether we are going to be superseded or not as humans, and I was amused by the fact that when I went to the website of this Danish company, the one who claimed to have coined Cobot, the first thing that you need to do when going into that webpage is clicking the captcha, confirming that I am not a robot. So they are making sort of the distinction there.
Yeah.
I still have some value as a human. Manoj, thank you so much. This was very informative and enjoyable to listen to. Everyone out there, stick tuned to our social media and our YouTube channel and our newsletters. We have interesting webinars coming up. I'm sure you will see Dr. Chiba here at some point in the future, maybe with some fantastic new AI, maybe Industry 6.0, who knows? There will be a 6G webinar, which I will be presenting later on this fall. I think it's the 17th of November, if I'm not completely mistaken. Check that out. And apart from that, I can only wish you a fantastic rest of the day. So, Manoj, stick around. We'll do the debrief after this. But thank you so much for the talk. And everyone, take care. Good night.